Something has shifted in the Middle East, and Western media is largely failing to explain it properly. For 18 months, the United States funded, armed, and diplomatically shielded one of the most devastating military campaigns the world has witnessed in decades. No meaningful hesitation, no serious pressure. Then, almost overnight, Washington began talking about ceasefires, frameworks, negotiations. The question you should be asking is not whether that represents good news. The question is why now? Because the answer to that determines whether Iran survives as a regional power, whether Chinese influence across the Arab world accelerates, and whether America can still credibly present itself as the architect of global order. There are layers here the headlines are not showing you. Start with what actually changed, and it is uncomfortable. America did not lose a war. It lost something harder to measure and considerably harder to repair: credibility. Strategic defeat for a superpower does not look like burning armor columns. It looks like watching your closest regional partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, quietly signal that they can no longer be seen standing alongside you. It looks like a major diplomatic achievement becoming politically toxic across the Arab world. It looks like international legal institutions moving against allied leadership, and the country that has lectured the planet about the rule of law for 70 years being unable to stop it. Not unwilling, unable. That is what strategic defeat looks like. And at some point last year, Washington understood it was living through one. There is a domestic dimension to this as well, and it is tangled up with ethnicity, religion, and electoral mathematics in ways most analysts prefer to avoid. Coalitions dependent on specific voting constituencies began fracturing. Communities that had been reliable in swing states made clear they would not deliver votes to a party they felt was watching a humanitarian catastrophe and calling it complicated. Younger voters, the generation that watched everything unfold in real time on their phones, began disengaging altogether. That is not a footnote. That is a structural problem for whoever holds office. Consider the current administration's calculation. It wants a grand Middle East settlement, the kind that comes with photographs and historic breakthrough speeches. It wants the regional normalization process that began years ago to reach completion. And the people advising on this have been unambiguous about one thing: you cannot achieve that normalization while the humanitarian situation looks the way it currently looks. So when Washington says it wants peace, what it is actually saying is, we need this crisis to stop dominating the story so we can return to the larger project. And the larger project is reshaping the region to contain Iran, integrate Israel economically, deliver security guarantees to Saudi Arabia, and keep China out of the room. The conflict was always treated as a distraction from that project. The distraction has now grown large enough to block the project entirely. Here is the part most commentators are getting wrong, and it is worth sitting with carefully. The United States and Israel do not want the same thing right now. They are allied, interdependent, bound by decades of shared history, but in this specific moment, their interests have diverged in a significant way. America wants an ending. It wants the fighting to stop, the hostages returned, some governing arrangement that removes Gaza from the front page so the broader regional reset can proceed. Israel's current government wants something different. Its coalition includes parties that openly advocate permanent resettlement and the elimination of any Palestinian political entity west of the Jordan River. These are not fringe voices. They are cabinet ministers who control budget allocations and can bring the government down if they feel insufficiently satisfied. And the Prime Minister himself faces multiple ongoing legal proceedings. His political survival is contingent on keeping that coalition intact, which means he cannot reach a deal his far-right partners would characterize as surrender. The result is a pattern. Pressure produces just enough visible cooperation to appear responsive. Negotiators are dispatched, frameworks are floated, agreements in principle are reached. Then, precisely when a deal appears close, new conditions emerge, or events on the ground intervene. Not every instance of this is necessarily deliberate. War carries its own chaotic momentum, and commanders make calls that escalate independently. But the pattern is consistent enough to demand scrutiny. Iran connects everything else in this region, and the standard Western narrative, Iran destabilizes, Iran arms proxies, Iran races toward a nuclear weapon, and the goal is containment, is coherent as far as it goes. But it omits something important. Iran is a nation of roughly 85 million people, with one of the more educated populations in the developing world. an economy that has not collapsed despite decades of sanctions, and a military doctrine that has proven effective at projecting influence without crossing the threshold into direct confrontation that would invite full retaliation. The network it constructed over decades, armed groups across Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, was always fundamentally a deterrence strategy. Iran could not match conventional American or Israeli firepower, so it built a ring of consequences instead. Attack us, and the cost is not contained to our borders. That strategy held for years. It is part of the reason a direct strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure never materialized. The retaliation calculation was too alarming. But here is the complication. Recent events have substantially degraded that deterrent architecture. Allied militant groups have absorbed serious blows. Intelligence penetrations have been described as historic humiliations. Senior leadership has been eliminated. A key supply corridor through Syria collapsed almost overnight when the government there fell. In the span of roughly a year, the protective shield Iran spent decades constructing became meaningfully thinner. Iran knows it. Israel knows Iran knows it. This is the part that ought to concern everyone, including serious figures inside Israel's own security establishment. Not the ideological hardliners, but professional military and intelligence voices who believe there is now a genuine window to strike Iran's nuclear program directly, while its air defenses and proxy network are at their weakest point in 2 decades. The argument runs, do it now, before Iran rebuilds, before the political mood in Washington shifts, before deterrence resets. This is not a prediction, it is a live debate. There are equally serious voices in Israel warning that such action would be catastrophic, that it could unify Iranian society behind the regime, trigger a wider regional war, permanently damage relationships with Arab neighbors, and possibly fail regardless, because the most critical facilities are buried beyond reach without external assistance. But the pressure for this option is real, and those advocating it believe the window is closing. What does China see watching all of this unfold? China sees an America that is not militarily weaker, its armed forces remain the most powerful on Earth, but that is strategically and diplomatically exhausted in the eyes of much of the developing world. Beijing's brokered diplomacy between regional rivals a couple of years ago was not primarily about supplanting American influence. It was a signal that major regional players are hedging, creating options, refusing dependency on a single patron. Every week that a crisis erodes American credibility makes that argument easier for Beijing to advance, without Beijing needing to do anything except observe. China does not want a wider war. A regional conflict disrupts oil markets Beijing depends upon, destabilizes infrastructure corridors it is developing across Central Asia, and generates the kind of instability that is damaging both to trade and to the image of reliable partnership China wishes to project. Beijing's position on a potential strike against Iran is, in essence, straightforward. Don't. That has been communicated through diplomatic channels repeatedly. But Beijing also knows it cannot prevent an ally from acting if that ally decides to act, and it cannot prevent a patron from enabling it. On the hostage situation, it must be stated plainly because it matters and it is real. There are still people being held. Families are still waiting. That is not a political abstraction, it is a human one, and any honest analysis must hold that fully. But there is an uncomfortable layer. The issue has also become, for parts of the current government, a political instrument as much as a humanitarian priority. Every time negotiators approach a framework that could bring people home, voices within the government produce reasons to step back. And when those reasons are examined closely, they are frequently not about the hostages at all. They are about refusing to conclude the campaign on terms that would require withdrawing without achieving the broader political objectives certain coalition members are demanding. Families themselves have said this, publicly, in the streets, accusing their leadership of treating their loved ones as justification for a war that serves political survival more than it serves their return. The grief is real. The instrumentalization of that grief is also real. Both things are simultaneously true. Something has shifted in how international law functions during this period, and historians will be examining it for a long time. Courts found plausible violations. Arrest warrants were issued against Allied leadership, the first time in that institution's history. Resolution after resolution passed at the international level demanding a ceasefire. None of it changed anything on the ground. International law has never been enforced with perfect consistency. Powerful states have always operated with greater impunity than weaker ones. But there is a meaningful difference between imperfect enforcement and what now resembles a near-complete breakdown of enforcement mechanisms for states operating under great power protection. Every authoritarian government weighing the use of force against a neighbor has been watching that breakdown and taking careful notes. The argument that a rules-based order makes aggression costly depends entirely on aggression actually being costly. That argument has taken a serious blow. Not necessarily fatal, but serious. 3 frameworks for what comes next, not predictions. The first, the deal holds. A ceasefire is reached. Hostages return in phases. Some form of international administration manages reconstruction without full military occupation or the restoration of the previous governing structure. The path toward broader regional normalization reopens. This is what official diplomacy is nominally working toward. It is also the least likely outcome in the near term because it requires concessions the current coalition will not accept and will punish for accepting. The second, the strike happens. With or without explicit outside authorization, Iran's nuclear infrastructure is targeted. Retaliation follows through whatever combination of direct and proxy capability remains available. The region enters sustained escalation. Shipping lanes are threatened, oil prices spike, an already fragile global economy absorbs another significant shock. Whether the nuclear program was genuinely set back or simply driven underground and accelerated remains unanswered for years. Broader normalization becomes politically impossible. Alternative patrons become more attractive to Gulf states. Global strategic resources are stretched thinner across multiple simultaneous fronts. The third, the slow freeze. No deal, no strike. A settlement into ongoing low-level conflict, devastated undergoverned territory, periodic operations, gradual reconstitution of armed groups, a nuclear program continuing at whatever pace its custodians determine, and the world slowly normalizing what should never be treated as normal. This is arguably the most likely near-term outcome. It is also arguably the worst long-term outcome for every party involved, including the stronger side. Permanent low-level conflict drains an economy, accelerates the emigration of exactly the skilled professionals a modern economy requires, and gives an adversary the time and space to quietly rebuild everything that was degraded. Here is the question that receives insufficient attention. What do the people actually living through this want? Not the governments, not the militaries, not the outside funders and think tanks and regional powers that benefit in various ways from the suffering continuing while doing nothing concrete to end it. The actual people. On one side, people who built lives in a place their families created, with security fears that are entirely legitimate and cannot be dismissed. On the other, people who have been stateless for generations, who have watched peace process after peace process collapse, living in the wreckage of what was already one of the most resource-poor and densely populated places on the planet. And here is what is striking. Serious polling on both sides, when the question is about long-term outcomes rather than immediate politics, reveals something similar. One population overwhelmingly wants security and an end to constant fear, and does not, when asked directly, want indefinite control over the other side's territory. The other overwhelmingly wants dignity and statehood, and does not endorse violence against civilians as a method, even while understanding the desperation that produces it. What both groups say they actually want is structurally achievable. Not tomorrow. It would require enormous political courage, sustained external pressure, and concessions that hardliners on both sides would call betrayal. But it is not impossible. Imperfect, painful versions of exactly this kind of resolution have happened elsewhere in recent history. What is currently impossible is not peace itself. What is currently impossible is peace without dismantling the incentive structure that rewards the people currently in power for prolonging the conflict rather than resolving it. That is the actual problem, not ancient hatred, not irreconcilable difference. A misalignment between who holds power and what would genuinely serve the people they govern. Here is why this matters to anyone watching from elsewhere in the world. The international order that structured global relations for the better part of a century, imperfect, frequently hypocritical, but real, runs on a set of norms regarding sovereignty, civilian protection, and accountability that are supposed to apply even to the powerful. What happens in this region over the next year will either reinforce those norms or erode them further. If something resembling a genuine resolution is brokered, not perfect, but real, it partially restores the credibility of that entire framework. If things freeze into permanent catastrophe or spiral into wider war, the lesson every government on Earth draws is simple. The rules do not apply once the powerful decide they are inconvenient. And once that lesson is fully absorbed, it changes how every major power calculates its next move, everywhere. We are at one of those hinge points where decisions made in the coming months will shape the available options for decades. Wanting peace and actually building it are two very different things. Whatever comes next, a deal, a strike, or a slow drift into frozen conflict, will determine which version of the next era the rest of us are living in.